This is African Voices TV from Chef Live. It's Enoch presenting. Today, the guest with me is Chiwe Chihana. How are you, Chiwe?
Hi, Enoch. Thanks for having me today.
As usual, we are having a special edition of International Women's Day, and Chiwe is here to give us an overview of what happened during that day. How did it go, Chiwe?
Oh, Enoch, thanks for asking. I'm really excited that we are actually covering International Women's Day, Women's Month. It's quite a significant year, especially that it's 25 years since the Beijing Declaration, and also this is the 5th year since the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, and obviously my interest around that would be Sustainable Development Goal 5. So all in all, it has been quite eventful, different things happening around the United Kingdom within the African women's diaspora, as well as the Student Affairs, African Student Affairs Network at Sheffield University.
Okay. Well, it sounds interesting. Seems as though it was a busy day that day, packed full of interesting stuff.
Well, thankfully, it was across several days because it's a whole month dedicated. So the first event that we actually did as this particular program, so as African Voices platform, we are part of the African Diaspora Women's Network Steering Committee, which is based here in the United Kingdom, but obviously works across the diaspora. And we had a one-day conference on the 29th of February, so just sort of the last day of February, so we could usher in the month of March. And subsequent to that, we've also since had the Women's Day, International Women's Day engagement with the students and staff members of the University of Sheffield's African Affairs Network. So for that one, I was actually the keynote speaker on behalf of African Voices platform. And then in the London one, which was dubbed Strengthening Our Collective Voices, I was the host of the day. So I think as a program, we've done quite well. You should be proud.
Absolutely. That sounds very interesting. And when someone talks about International Women's Day, there's lots of understanding, people understanding differently. As an African woman, what does that represent? And, what are the benefits, if you would like to say, anything about, it could be, the young women, both in diaspora and the women on the continent, how do you, describe to someone who doesn't understand the benefits of that important day, especially to African women, both on the continent, both in diaspora?
Okay, thanks. That's a very important question to ask. I think in general, for me, International Women's Day is a pivotal moment that recognizes that we're still on a journey where we're fighting for women's equality, and it's inclusive of everyone in terms of women who are on the continent, women in diaspora, women in the villages, women in the cities, but obviously within that framework there are different aspects that are key and crucial that people are still fighting for, or people are also celebrating. So you've got to remember, it's not just a case of highlighting what we're fighting for or trying to achieve in terms of women's rights, but we're also looking at celebrating what women have achieved and getting that recognition.
Oh, thank you. You recently attended a conference in London, which was part of the African Diaspora Women's Network. What lessons, would you say came out of that conference?
I think the biggest one for me was the multi-generational engagement, because in my time was the 1995 generation. I was a girl at the time when the Beijing conference took place, but it means that I have to understand that what we fought for then might not necessarily translate into what the young people of today are fighting for. So it was really good to have a cross-generation. Like I said, there was the generation of women who actually went to Beijing. They were our mothers back then. And then there's my generation, and there were also their grandchildren today who were in that room, and we're all talking about how to tackle some of these issues, what's still pending, what's more relevant to this generation that's going to go ahead of us beyond today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and is there, any action plan in place at the moment that, policymakers, especially, women who are the voices of the voiceless, in communities, both in Africa, across the continent, or even across the world, if I should say. Are there champions, whom you would point out or highlight, to basically say these are the people that are actually championing, who are kind of like pushing the rights of these girls and the women across the world? We all know, as you just mentioned, it might be so much easier to read all those policies on paper, but actually to see them in practice, 25 years after the Beijing conference, a few things have been implemented. A few things have actually taken place. It was all talked about, in words, in conferences. There were big speakers out there, but actually, even I as a man, I won't really say that I've seen quite a lot of what happened from that conference, or even 25 years, things should have moved on. Things should have been achieved already. Maybe not all of them, but just a few things that were discussed in that conference should have been taking place now, where every person out there would celebrate International Women's Day, can actually celebrate and say, this is what we've achieved after 25 years later. What do you say on that?
Okay, so there are two things that you've put across to me. So the first one being, are there any notable figures that are actually championing these causes? I think there are so many across the whole world. I loathe to fall into the trap of talking about the big names such as the Winnie Byanyimas or Amina Mohammed, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And those are African women that I'm highlighting. I mean, there are voices like Chimamanda Adichie that are speaking up, but also it's the women as well at the grassroots. There are all these activist organizations at the very grassroots that are actually taking charge and going into these communities, especially in the African sense, and sensitization. And there are also organizations that I'm aware of that provide access to education for girls, such as CAMFED. So there are quite a lot of those, but they would not be able to realize what they are realizing. I mean, there has been progress. Progress is slow to say that, but it's not like there has not been progress, because right now people do know about things like, the gender pay gap. We're talking about things like that now because there were women who went before us who fought for those things. Otherwise, they would not be there today. So in that sense, I do think that there are so many women that should be heralded, so many heroes of the struggle, of the movement, that are not championed, but they are there at grassroots level, especially because they're the change makers there.
Okay. What would you say would be a role of the men, within this International Women's Framework? Is there anything you would say that maybe a man could play a part or could play any sort of role in empowering women across, every platform out there, to have that voice, to push for these rights, for them to be realized? Do you think there is any position for men? Because as a man, when I hear about International Women's Day, I think, that's just for the women, has nothing to do with me. But is there anything you would tell our viewers that, even men are a part of this movement?
Actually, to the contrary, men are a big part of this, because you can't achieve gender equality without bringing men on board. So African women have always championed the cause that men are partners in the fight to bringing women up, for gender equality to actually take place. Or even in the case of domestic violence, for example, if you're talking about violence against women and girls, 75% of victims of domestic violence are women. But if you don't engage men in the conversation, how will that end? You can't leave one group behind without having conversations. So men are part and parcel of this. For example, there's the He for She campaign at the moment. If you've come across that, that's a partnership between men and women. So men are also speaking out and championing women's rights, girl-child education, especially with the as for He for She program, as you will actually see in the conference developments that we did last month.
During this International Women's Day, there was an event at Sheffield University. Would you like to tell us about that event?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and very impressively. So, the University of Sheffield's African Affairs Network asked me to be their keynote speaker for International Women's Day. And so I went there to talk about this year's theme and also to talk about where I stand as far as women's rights are concerned, but also what I sort of would like to see future generations do with it and how they could engage with women's rights in general, not necessarily highlighting just the one day, which is International Women's Day. So I think for Sheffield, it's very impressive that we have this network amongst the students that's actually taking a keen interest as diaspora students on what's happening on the African continent and what the African women's rights movement looks like and how they can actually tap into that themselves. So I was really impressed with that.
Okay. Was that a specific just to university students, or is this something that even other Sheffield local residents, specifically like African women, could join?
So it was organized by the African Affairs Network, and no, it was not limited to women. So the audience, as you will see on the footage, we had males and females, and yes, it was open to the whole lot of Sheffield and anybody else who was really interested in coming to it.
We'll have a look at the footage of the events in London and the one in Sheffield.
Today's event is a collaboration as part of the African Diaspora Women's Network, which is a network of African women, organizations, as well as individuals who are really keen to enable Africans working in development to come together to share our learning, but also for us to really learn how to work together to amplify our voices and our issues.
Yeah. Why is it important for the diaspora community to engage with African specific topics?
I think it's critical that the diaspora, we are Africans and we still have Africa deep in our blood. And for a lot of us, we have a lot of links. So that transnational issue and nature of our issues makes it very imperative that we contribute. We also have language similarities with Africa. We have food similarities with Africa. But we also have deep roots in Africa because a lot of us have, a foot here and a foot back at home. So I think it's important that we engage on the issues because the issues back home also affect us here.
Yeah, so as I said, when I worked for Femnet about 2 years ago, we played a key role in mobilizing African women to engage in the process that led to the development of the SDGs and really making sure that issues affecting African women and girls were brought to the fore to inform the global development for sustainable development goals. And so we did that by really mobilizing diverse voices of African women, working with different constituencies and social justice movements, including, of course, strengthening the movement within the women's movement, but also strengthening our collaboration with other civil society organizations and youth movements, including young women's movements, to ensure that the issues that we're talking about are really taken seriously and are informing the SDGs. And it was great to see the standalone gender goal 5, that talks about gender equality and achieving women's empowerment, and with a specific target that we really pushed it for. But also we advocated for financing for development, which is a key component of ensuring that SDGs are implemented. And after the SDGs were adopted, we also convened African women, organizations and movements to come together and draw a roadmap on how they can play a critical role in the implementation phase in terms of holding their government accountable, in terms of advocating for increased resources that are going to enable the integration and the implementation of the gender equality agenda of the SDGs, and that continues to catalyze actions in different African countries led by African women's rights organizations and women's rights activists to ensure that the gender agenda of the SDGs is not forgotten in the implementation phase.
Thank you very much for that. So whilst we're still talking about the direct work of leading women's organizations in Africa, and of course Femnet is quite a strong one across the continent, when it comes to policy implementation, especially resource mobilizations across governments and how you influence that, what are your biggest hurdles with government?
So the biggest hurdle around allocating resources for gender equality and women's rights. One is that there are so many priorities that governments can support, but also inadequacy of resources by the government themselves on the African continent. Of course, we know that Africa is rich, but we also know that majority of resources leave the continent to go to the global north through things like illicit financial flows, where it is estimated that Africa loses $50 billion per year through illicit financial flows that leave the continent. But we also know that a lot of money also gets lost in repayment of public debt. Oftentimes the terms are not favorable to the African governments, who actually play a very small role in terms of determining how those policies are agreed upon. And so then the challenge becomes, if so much resources are leaving the continent, and we know that actually more resources leave the continent than what comes to the continent through international aid, despite the fact that we also know that international aid is reducing. And so then it really becomes difficult to be able to advocate for increased resources to implement the women's rights agenda. But some of the things that Femnet is continuing to do, and other women's rights organizations on the African continent, is to also advocate for a transformation of the global economy that would change that system that continuously make sure that African governments continue to be disfavored and resources are continuing to leave the continent. Because if we could then make sure those resources remain on the continent, we would be able to finance all the public services that are very important in advancing women's rights and gender equality, including education, health care, infrastructure around unpaid care work that is disproportionately done by women and girls, and therefore that would move us towards achieving women's rights.
Thank you very much for that. In the context of your Womankind role, what is it you do with Womankind, and any obvious links right now to the Beijing 25+?
Yes, so I'm currently working with the Womankind Worldwide, which is an international women's rights organization founded and working and based here in the UK, but works with women's rights organization in Africa and Asia. And so my role, I'm Director of Policy and Communication, and what we are really focusing on at Womankind currently in the context of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is to join the global movement in terms of really taking opportunity for the 25 years anniversary of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action to call for actions to accelerate actions around women's rights and gender equality. We are doing that by supporting women's rights organizations and movements in Africa and Asia to work with their governments and hold them accountable to putting in more effort to advancing the women's rights agenda, but also for them to mobilize their constituencies and to come up with shadow reports that brings about the perspective and the voices of their constituencies in different communities and different countries in terms of their perspective of how far we have gone in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. We also developing a report, a feminist report with other global organizations, including AWID, Civicus, Gender and Development Network that is also based here, to really show how far we have come with Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, but also the gaps that are still in existence and what needs to happen, the transformation that needs to happen. We are really, in this report, we are calling for addressing the systematic structural barriers to women's rights. That is extremely important to remove those barriers to create an environment where gender equality can be achieved and women's rights can be realized. We are also going to be participating in the UN Commission on the Status of Women in New York, which is supposed to happen actually next, just 1 week away, and we are going to be convening a session which is going to focus on the role of women's rights organizations and movements in bringing about change, including the role they have played in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. At Womankind, we really do believe in the power of women's movements, in the power of working together. We believe that we need all generations to bring about that change. We believe that we need the diversities of all women, whether it is women with disabilities, whether it is grassroots women, young women, adolescent girls. It is extremely important for intersection of these diversities to work together to bring about change. And so that's what we are going to be showcasing at CSW, that when you work with movements and when you make sure that you are addressing the intersection of inequalities, then you are able to bring about change.
Thank you very much. Just one last thing. How do you feel about people's arguments that these movements are just talk shops and they never really affect change?
I would say that actually there is a lot of research that has now been out that actually shows that strong, resilient, autonomous movements bring about change. So I would refer to such people who don't think that women's movements have brought a change to actually to go and use the argument using evidence and research that has been there. Actually, some research show that strong women's movements bring about change more than political parties, more than governments, more than anything else that we can think of. That actually the gains that we have within the achieving gender equality and women's rights is mainly because of women's movements and women's organizations. And there's evidence to show that.
The Diaspora Women's Network is a coalition. It's the coming together of women's rights organizations and individuals from the diaspora with the common goal of attaining SDG 5, which is gender equality and empowerment for women and girls.
Literally, it's hot off the press, fresh out today. I've only just seen it 5 minutes ago myself. And it's called The Space Between Black and White, and it's a mixed race memoir.
Brilliant. And what's the significance of it? Why should people go for that book?
Well, I think its time has come. I've been writing it for the last 20 years. And I feel that at the moment there is a lot of talk about mixed race and a lot of interest in the subject. But I don't think anyone really knows what it means and what it is to live in the space between black and white, which I have done all my life. And this is a story of my childhood and isolation and going through my adulthood, being engaged in organizations around diversity and African diaspora and longing to find out where I belong. And that's why I've written the book, because I think a lot of people are struggling with those issues, and I hope this will shed some more in-depth light on it.
Thank you very much, and also really appreciate that we've got the exclusive today.
Yes.
I also note that you were the keynote speaker today
Yes.
at the African Diaspora Women's Network event. What is the significance of an event like this one?
Well, I'm very excited to have been asked to come and talk about Beijing +5. It just doesn't seem like 25 years ago since I was at that conference. I think it was a formative moment in my life, a watershed moment for me, being with 50,000 other feminists from all around the world. It was an extraordinary experience, and at the time we were struggling with the language, trying to work out what we wanted in this declaration of women's empowerment around the world. We didn't realize quite how much we were making history, and I was reading my platform for action just last night, the original copy, and thinking a lot of this stands today. It is still relevant, still beautiful, still what we need. We've in 25 years we've learnt a lot, we've added to it, but it still stands as a testament to solidarity for women around the world, and we are going to fly that flag now really high, because women around the world are beleaguered. We are feeling the pressure, the changes, climate change and economic changes affect women much more than they do men, and we need to keep going and keep that solidarity which was so evident in Beijing.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask you one last question. When you look at the Beijing Declaration from an African perspective and the contributions of all those powerful women whose shoulders we stand on today,
Yes.
Is there anything significant that you say that was actually brought in by the women from the African continent, and it has stood the test of time within the Beijing Declaration?
Yes, I think we were really strong on advocating for the inclusion of the girl child as part of the Beijing Platform for Action. We've got 12 critical areas of concern, and that was the one that I think is thanks to the African women's community to put that on record. And it's so relevant today when we have so many attacks on girls for receiving an education. We have FGM, we have forced marriages, we have young marriage, and so on. But at the same time, I want to pay tribute to the spirit of African women. I've worked with African women all over the continent, and the things that we are doing are absolutely incredible. With next to nothing, we are the future, not the aid agencies and the corporates and so on. We are the future. We have the models, we have the strength, we have the power, and we have the energy.
Right, as we're coming to the conclusion of our talk show today, I'd like to know, or even to our viewers, what are the lessons you think were important to these two events, the one in London and the one in Sheffield?
Okay, so with the Sheffield one, it was really refreshing to engage with somebody who, with some of the young people who may not understand the context of why we're still talking about women's rights. So I remember one of the significant questions that I was asked was, and this is to no ridicule, because people would ridicule a question like that, but I think it was a very important one. So a young man asked me in the audience and said, would you be for gender equity or gender equality? And I explained to him that I was for gender equality because we haven't yet reached gender parity for us to be talking about equity. So there are so many things where women have still not attained rights. So it was nice to have that kind of conversation and explain why it's important to still talk about gender equality, because gender equity will have its time, but we're still having to reach gender equality for us to actually get into equity talks. Then with the London one, I think I was very empowered. I mean, I was the host of the day, but our partner organizations such as Make Every Woman Count, Forward UK, Afford, all these organizations that directly have a seat on the African Union, we're speaking from a platform where we're not just having a diaspora voice that speaks to diaspora issues, but we're talking as women of the African continent and what progress we've made and where we want to see ourselves. And quite crucially, we were going to go into March. It was the day before March started. So in March, traditionally, we have the Commission on the Status of Women that takes place at the United Nations. So that in the lead up to the September conference, United Nations General Conference. And so there were themes arising out of that felt were key to taking back. So we had Womankind being represented, we had Femnet being represented. I think that was really important because we don't live in isolation being women of the diaspora. The issues that women on the continent face are issues that we have as well. So when we're talking about things like childhood marriages, FGM, etc., and all those things, and policy, we are all the same. And I felt that this was a very good platform, and we were able to champion our heroes who made it possible for us to have these kinds of conversations. And I think that's my biggest takeaway.
Well, thank you so much. It was good, having you today.
Thanks a lot for having this dedicated show as well.
And thanks for our viewers. Until next time, see you now from Chef Live, African Voices.